right, well, welcome to our first History Talks program. Today is Lacey Then, Lacey Now. My name is Marissa Merkel. I don't know if you've met me. Some of you have. Some of the folks in the front, some of you have not. I'm the museum educator, so I will be introducing Erin today, but a few little orders of business here. So like I said, this is our first History Talks program, so we really would appreciate, we have audience evaluation forms in the front. If you would fill those out, help us improve, because we will be having someone here on March 18th. Her name is Mayumi Tsujikawa. She will be discussing Washington's undiscovered feminists. So it'll be a really interesting topic. After that, we'll be having Sasquatch Revealed. I know for some of you who are our avid newsletter readers, you'll have seen some of that. Phones right now. That is the largest collection of Sasquatch-related artifacts and artwork in the continental United States and Canada. Pretty impressive. So please come see us. That will be May 31st. We will also be having our historic neighborhood walking tour that we always do. This time it should be in June. This year we'll focus on immigration. And we're going to have a brand new program this year, which will be our historic bus tour in the fall. So stay tuned for more details. Without further ado, I will introduce our curator, Erin Quinn Valcho. Is a native Washingtonian who grew up in Bellingham and graduated from Pacific Lutheran University. Any Lutes? No? Okay. Graduate school took her to Colorado, where she graduated from the University of Denver with a master's in anthropology and museum studies. She's been a museum professional for over 20 years with positions at the Denver Art Museum, Denver Firefighters Museum, and the Greenlee Museums. Also, us. She is currently on the editorial board of the Thurston County Historical Journal, and she has been the curator at Lacey Museum for over 5 years and is glad to have found her home with us. So please welcome Erin.
Thank you, Marissa. Well, good evening. I am so delighted to be here with you today to share a bit of Lacey's history with some fun stories and my favorite photographs. So check out this gorgeous photo that was taken by a drone over our 3rd of July fireworks spectacular last summer. You might wonder why I'm showing you a modern picture when this is a program about history, and it's because, well, it's really awesome. Am I right? Also, this photograph is going to be our history in the future, so it's important that we start collecting those things now. And it makes a lovely, striking contrast to this aerial from 1963, also featuring a barely visible Mount Rainier. Besides the fact that this was clearly a normal misty day in Washington, and the previous one was one of those rare, gorgeous summer days, there's the obvious difference in the color, this image being black and white by contrast. But think about this photograph being the heart of Lacey. To orient you, the main thoroughfare here is Pacific, right? And this at the left there is St. Martin's. And especially notable, I think, are the huge swaths of forest and wide open spaces between houses. Of course, there are no roundabouts there where Lacey and Pacific come together. And there's also no development on that wedge in the center, where today there's Walgreens and Starbucks, many light industrial businesses like Sunset Air and places like that. It just looks very open. So today I'm going to take you on a little journey through photographs, mostly from our own collection, that will show you how we got from here to there, and we'll talk about some interesting, or more there to here, right? And we'll talk about some interesting characters in between. So let's get started. Here is an overhead shot of the area that we were just looking at. What is the most striking feature in this aerial? Racetrack, right? It was 1 mile in circumference, and it was a main feature of the Lacey area from 1891 until it was turned into a housing development in the early 70s. All that's left of the racetrack now is this small neighborhood park and a historic marker. It's located just behind the post office off of Lacey Boulevard. It's on Clearbrook Street if you want to go take a look yourself. There are very few pictures historically of the racetrack or the grounds. This one was taken from a promotional booklet put out by the Olympia Chamber of Commerce. You can just make out that entrance sign right here that says Woodland Driving Park. At left are the stables, and the clubhouse is there on the right. An article from 1891 described it like this: "The first impression upon the visitor is an agreeable surprise, as after leaving the shady road, a perfectly level plain breaks upon the view. About 200 yards south of the depot is the clubhouse, the finest of its kind in the Northwest. On the other side of the clubhouse are the stables, which are desirably situated, as they are far enough away from the clubhouse so that the stable odors do not reach the latter, and they are close enough to be readily reached. The race course is a mile track, perfectly level the entire distance around, and the home stretch is really elegant. The quality of the track is such that even after a 3 days' rain, it is sure to be within 2 hours in excellent condition. The ground has just enough sand to absorb all water quickly." With the gushing in the newspaper of the greatness of this track, no proprietor, and there were many, in quick succession, none could make a go of it. Take note of the clubhouse here as we move on to this next photo. This hotel by 1901, this building was no longer the clubhouse. It was the Woodland Hotel and later the Lacey Hotel. We recently acquired this really great photograph, the only one that I've ever seen like it that has that big Woodland Hotel sign on the front. Here are Bridget and Thomas Kenny, who came to Olympia from Michigan to run the hotel. The hotel was a major hub in the town of Woodland, and that's what the area was called back then. Mail was delivered at the post office, which was situated here, and so people were regularly in and out. It's no wonder that 2 of their daughters became postmasters. This 1915 map will give you a feel for what existed in our small community at the time. You can see Pacific Avenue and Lacey Boulevard. What is now called Adams Street was called Adams Street is Bowker now. The railway line that cuts right through the middle is where the Karen Fraser Woodland Trail is now. The Lacey Hotel is on Lacey Boulevard, and the train depot was right here along Pacific. So Olympia would be off to the left and the Senior Center and Community Center off to the right now. As we move into the next slide, we're going to be talking a little bit about the Russell House, which I'm sure many of you know became a very important structure in Lacey's history. The house in this picture was built in 1926, replacing the structure that was drawn on that 1915 map. The Russell family, who owned the house, owned a confectionery store, billiards hall, and gas station just to the west of the house. Word is that it was an off-limits hangout for students at St. Martin's College. Does anybody know for sure? Pictured here are Fred, Minnie, and their son, Randolph. They had another son, Gerald, at the time the house was built. Really cool is that the house was built from Minnie's own designs by a local architect. An unusual feature of the house is that it was originally done in stucco, which, as you know, is not the best choice for this climate. 1950s owners of the house were the Jordan family, and this is Dwight Jordan, who owned horses and competed in harness racing. You can see him hooked up behind the horse in this chariot-like carriage called a sulky. Personally, I think it would be kind of dangerous to be on that end of the horse, but in any event, it would have been quite convenient to have the racetrack literally across the street from his house. Dwight's son, Rex, became Lacey's first paid fire chief, and the house was turned into the fire station headquarters with big bays for the engines next door. After Lacey became a city officially in 1966 with no small amount of help from the fire department, they graciously shared their space to make way for City Hall. Pictured here are the first 3 city employees the police chief, and 2 patrolmen, using their own vehicles because the young city had no revenue. They couldn't buy much of anything, much less police cars. That car in the center is still running around town, and you can see it. It's owned by a business owner on Pacific, and it still looks that color. I always thought that was just a faded photograph, but it really does look that color. Today, that house and truck bay are Pope John Paul II High School and the Lacey Museum. The high school is in its original location, but the training tower behind it remains, although it's really hard to see in this picture, but the little tippy top of it is right there. The museum was moved to a piece of land that was donated for the museum, and it is tucked into the historic neighborhood right off of Pacific Avenue. And if you haven't been there, we have rack cards, and you're welcome to pick one up and come visit us. Marissa will be there to give you a tour. So the whole reason why this area of Lacey became the center of town, or the wide spot in the road, as some cynical travelers termed it, is because in 1891, the Northern Pacific Railway made the decision to put a rail line through the area. That was the same year the post office, the hotel, the racetrack, and a store came to the area, turning scattered farms into a more cohesive community. The Lacey Depot was another significant feature of the landscape in early Lacey. From the same article I read to you about the clubhouse came this description of the depot. An exceedingly handsome railroad station has been erected by the Northern Pacific Company, which would do credit to a city. The depot would have been painted a stately brick red with forest green trim. The mail was delivered to the depot, and until the automobile became widespread, this was how people got around. It was in operation from August 1891 until 1933. Train service continued after that. Mail was still delivered, and passengers could flag down the train. It was torn down in about 1950 to make way for the Lacey Plywood Company. The location right next to the rail line made it an ideal place to build. It started operations with 90 employees, shipping out its first load of plywood in January 1951. By 1962, there were 130 employees, and at one part, it was Lacey's 3rd largest employer. It was also unique because it was a working shareholders corporation, meaning it was owned by the employees. This sign, painted onto the side of the Lacey Plywood Company building, shows the optimism of the housing and building boom in the 1960s. But a couple of decades later, in the 1980s, the company started struggling. Material costs were skyrocketing, and their machinery had become outdated. The company shut down in August 1988 with less than a week's warning to their employees. The existing buildings were mostly dismantled by 1991. In 1995, a new building was built for a retail carpet store. And in 2016, the property was purchased by the city of Lacey to become the new Lacey Museum. At left is the existing building, and at right is a very early concept drawing of what the building might look like after remodeling. I think it will be a marvelous transformation. Let's take a quick look back at that 1915 map to see where this building is in relationship to the original depot. The first phase in the new museum project, as I'm sure you've read about in the newspaper, will be to reconstruct the depot near its original location. The bidding process should open up on this project in the next few weeks, so really soon. It's almost ready. At the same time as the depot rebuilt, access to the site will be created with the addition of an extension of Lebanon Street, which is right here. This street doesn't exist yet. And we will also be putting in this parking lot here so that we will have parking in this first phase to the depot structure. So it's meant to be a trail amenity for the Woodland Trail, and we're also planning, pending site review, a train-themed play structure, which will also go in phase 1. And depending on the results of our soil testing, we're hoping to also have a food forest with help from, both of these projects will be with help from the Lacey Rotary and St. Martin's University, who's going to help us maintain it. So we're really excited about that. Phase 2 is dependent on funding. I'm delighted to share that we have made the funding list for a Washington State Heritage Capital Grant to complete construction documents. We are waiting to see if the legislature passes the budget and includes our project on it. It didn't make it onto the governor's budget, but I understand that that's not unusual, that he doesn't put all of the projects, well, he or she doesn't put all of the projects onto his budget. So we have to do some work to make sure that it gets onto the budget in final form. And we have, you may have already picked up, we have a postcard that you're welcome to take and share with your friends that lists all the projects, and the back lists more information about them. So we're really hopeful, cautiously optimistic that we'll be able to start our construction documents in the summer. And then, if that happens, then we'll be able to start getting money raised for the next phase to start actually building and do our capital campaign. All right, let's move on. To orient you to this 1872 map, this is Chambers Lake, this is Hicks Lake, and this is Long Lake. As we have talked about early Lacey history so far, the name Woodland has popped up a few times, of course. That's because originally this central area of what would become Lacey was known as Woodland. There were three main areas that would become Lacey as indicated on this map. In addition to Woodland, you have up here Hawk's Prairie, which was not named for the bird, but for settler John Hawk. And at lower left, there is Chambers Prairie, named for the Chambers family that settled here, and incidentally, the very first American settlers in the Lacey area, period. So we'll start there, with the first American settlers in the Lacey area, the Chambers family. Elizabeth Harrison married David Chambers on April 8th, 1845. Less than 3 weeks later, they left Missouri on the Oregon Trail in a wagon train. Quite the honeymoon, huh? They encountered many obstacles, including exposure to the measles, huge herds of bison, skirmishes with Native Americans, and wide rivers to cross. At the age of 82, she wrote of their house, "Our place was 3 miles east of Olympia, on the road leading to Fort Steilacoom, where we took up 640 acres of government land and built a frame house in which Mary A. Chambers was born on November 9th, 1853, a few days after moving in. This was the home for which we had endured the hardships of crossing the plains and the dangers of a frontier country." She had 7 children, all of whom made it into adulthood. In addition to their farm and orchards in Lacey, the family had a meat market in downtown Olympia on 4th Street. I found this great photo of it that I had to share. It's so rare to find really great interior shots of stores inside. That's cool. And then, after Elizabeth Chambers' husband died, she moved to California to live with one of her daughters, and the property became a golf course. First, the land was leased by the Olympia Golf and Country Club, and later it became the Mountain View Golf Course. The original Chambers house became outfitted as the clubhouse. And if you've ever driven on Golf Club Road and wondered, why do we have that? Now you know. That's where it was. In 1966, the Olympian noted, without much fanfare, that the rambling old building, built in 1854 by pioneer David Chambers on the highest hill in Lacey, is about to be reduced to splinters and planks by Panorama City wrecking crews. Instead of being saddened by the loss of this important piece of history, there seemed to be this gleeful cheering on of modernizing and bringing on the future. I mean, they even have like this beauty queen lighting the torch. Does anybody know what is here now? Not you, Balsley. You know all the stuff in my presentation. Anybody? Panorama, that's right. It's the chalet. Balsley, he's always right. Well, you know, I don't know. It doesn't say in the records. Look at the chalet. If you're familiar with what it looks like today, it's totally surrounded by trees. You couldn't get a shot like that today. So it was demolished, of course, to make way for those chalet apartments. It cost $1 million to build. In today's dollars, that would be $7.3 million. The image at right is the restaurant at Panorama right when it opened. Love the mid-century modern look to it. In partnership with the Lacey Historical Society and Panorama, a historical marker is in development and will be placed at the chalet to document this fascinating history. Speaking of retirement communities, does anyone here live in Jubilee by chance? No? Well, near that development, in the far northeast corner of Lacey, there stands the remnants of a dock. It's not as good as this picture because this is more recent, but it caught fire in 1976, but what is left is the only remaining vestiges of an industry that dominated what is now Hawks Prairie, explosives. This dock was used by the Atlas Powder Company, but we're going to focus our attention on another company also located in Hawks Prairie near what is now Deutero Road, which is kind of by where Meadows Elementary School is. We recently uncovered these terrific photos in our collection, those ones, of the J.A. Den Powder Company. I especially love this one on the left. It shows these women who are cartridge packers. They have gloves on, which I don't think would really help you if they exploded, but... on the right, the two men are making the explosives in the powder mixing building, which was a much more dangerous job. A stick of dynamite on its own is usually pretty stable, but the manufacturing process was very dangerous. A single spark could ignite flammable materials or trigger an explosion, and lethal incidents were very common in the industry. And this company made national news in 1934 when an explosion killed 11 people, and injured 6. 6 of the 8 buildings in the compound were demolished by the blast, including the powder mixing building. The explosions were heard as far away as Tacoma. An investigation concluded that the cause of the fire was unknown, although survivors told investigators at the time that they were working on extinguishing a fire that had started in the mixing building when it had exploded. 2 brothers, Clarence and Pearl Ullery, were killed. These photographs show the mixing building after the explosion. And according to survivor accounts, that building back there was lifted up off the ground from the explosion. On the back of this photograph, it reads, "This picture shows where Clarence was killed up toward the concrete building, and the mark on the big concrete slab is where Pearl was killed and blown 200 feet toward the office." Probably the most tragic loss that day was a 12-year-old boy named Oliver Wilson, who had been there with his stepfather, Henry Den Jr. Henry left the site of the explosion to help a badly burned man get to the hospital. And Oliver, after hearing the first minor explosion, ran toward the building to try to help when he was caught in the huge explosion that followed. So we've got a short news clip, which Marissa is going to help me show. It doesn't have any audio, so don't expect any. The trees are just stripped bare in that previous photo. Wow, huh? Pretty dangerous work. As far as I'm aware, other than the dock, there is nothing left of the dynamite plants in Hawks Prairie. Yeah. That was the inlet. Which one is that? By where? I can show you on a map. Yes. Is it really? I thought it was farther. Well, I got to drive up there. We should all drive up there. Add it to the bus tour. All right. So in an article in the 80s, just to go back to the explosion real quick, I did see that there was somebody's shed that was part of one of the old buildings, but I have no idea if it still stands, kind of over where there's a four-way stop when you're on your way to Meadows Elementary. My daughter goes there, so I can see it in my mind. Somewhere in there, but I don't know if it's still there. All right, let's move on to the third area that made up Lacey, Woodland. If you recall, this is the very center of our community. Isaac and Catherine Wood, Woodland's namesake, took out a 320 donation land claim in 1852, and he gave his farm the nickname Woodlawn. According to Wood family lore, Isaac's son Rollin devised the name Woodland for the farm and the community surrounding it. Isaac and two of his sons founded the first brewery in what would become the state of Washington in 1861. Bet you didn't know the first brewery was from Lacey people, did you? The Union Brewery, located on 4th and Columbia, lasted for 20 years. Writing about the eventual 1909 destruction of Wood's brewery building, one author observed nostalgically that the remaining pioneers would give $5 for a glass of that cream ale. It's possible that might be a slight exaggeration, given that that would be $133 today. But the Woods property extended from what is now the top edge of the historic neighborhood and a bit north of Lake Lois all the way past 20th Avenue to the south. After Isaac died, the property was divided among his 7 children, and one of them sold 33 acres to a man named John M. Adams. And in 1890, Mr. Adams platted the very first residential neighborhood, just east of St. Martin's campus, which is there today. And as you go into the area, you can see these brick monuments that let you know you have traveled into that area. And many of the homes on Lacey's Historic Register are in this neighborhood, and you can see many of them on our historic walking tour this summer. So then, if the heart of Lacey was called Woodland, how in the heck did it get to be called Lacey? Remember how we talked about the railroad bringing all the services to the area in 1891? Well, residents decided that it was definitely time for a post office. So in anticipation, they sent the forms in. And to their surprise, the form here was sent back and it said, select another name. Okay. Sadly, another Woodland had beat us to the punch 10 years before that one that's down near the Columbia River. So what we do know is that the name had to be short and unique, because it says it right there. Select a short name for the proposed office, which when written will not resemble the name of any other post office in the state. Apparently, mail was ending up all kinds of weird places. So here it says Lacey, but why? Tradition holds that this is the dude. His name is O.C. Lacey, and he was a real estate developer. Sadly, we don't have a picture of him, although I'm going to continue to search, because you never know. The only image we have comes from this court sketch. There's also no documentation about why the post office was named for him. After the post office application was approved, Lacey became an attorney and later justice of the peace. He also ran for a couple of local offices and lost every election. As a result, he was in the paper a lot, with both favorable and not so favorable articles. But what is clear is that he was an Olympia man. He did not own property in Lacey, and as far as we can tell, he didn't have any particular dealings in Lacey. But his reputation started to go downhill, and he was accused of stealing some records from the clerk's office. Articles began to appear alluding to his arrogance and his dishonesty. He traveled a lot for work, but in the summer of 1894, he went east, and the newspaper suggested that the people in town thought that he wasn't coming back. He didn't make any arrangements for his successor as judge, so another judge had to take over his office and his duties so the court's work could continue. Unfortunately, his wife, Emma, was very sickly, and it was she who suffered the most from his travel. He left her an invalid without care when he would go traveling, and when he was home, he became verbally abusive. A newspaper suggests that he was having an affair with another woman, which is what started this downward spiral. Her friends encouraged her to file for divorce, which was granted in 1895. Must have not been good, huh? So in 1869, she died on the floor of her friend's house. Newspapers lamented over her sad demise and the horrible way she'd been treated by her former husband. Is this the guy you want our town named after? All right, let's perk things up a bit after that topic. Let's talk about food. Here's a picture of a local restaurant, Puerto del Sol. Anybody been there? Is food good? All right, I should go there. And if you don't know, it's on Martin Way, across from River Ridge High School. So here's what it looked like in the 40s. It was the Richfield Tank and Tummy. How adorable. What changes did you notice? Although the tanks, of course, and the awning are no longer there, you can see the remnants of the garage door in that window. And this door and the steps. Yeah, it's definitely still the same building. You can see Rainbow Floral here on Pacific. It's on the north side of the roundabout on Pacific Avenue, if you're not familiar. And here's, Is it really? Well, how delightful. There's your house. It's okay. Here it is in the 80s. Who else is mystified that we're talking about the 80s as though it's history? When did that happen? Now I know how baby boomers feel. This restaurant was owned by Steve Kirkman, who now works for the city of Lacey in the public affairs department. I thought that was pretty funny when I found that out. Okay. All right, just for fun, here's a few buildings that don't exist anymore. Did you guys go here? 15 cents for fries. What else? Did they have good burgers? Longer hamburger buns. It was on Pacific. The exact location I had trouble pinning down. I just know the building. Oh, maybe we should get these guys to take us on a tour of Lacey. And the burger bar. Did anybody go there? This is an older one. I don't know how long it was there. Do you know? No? Did they? Yeah. Does anybody remember this place? I knew Balsley was going to like that. This one is in there just for you, Ken. So Richard's Roundhouse was at Market Square, kind of where Fred Meyer is now. It was a very happening place in the 70s. As you can see, it was built in the round out of brick, and the inside was decked out with railroad paraphernalia. The train car had some history of its own. The dining car was from President Harry Truman's 1948 whistle-stop tour around the country. My source on this, though, is Ken Balsley, so do with that as you will. Ken says that's now in Oakville. We'll say that for the cameras. So the owner's name was Richard Stromberg, and he said later that the factors that contributed to the decline of this restaurant were that competition pulled people away. A lot of cocktail bars started to come up, and they also put in a whole bunch of disco lighting, and then disco died. The Loose Caboose, that's right. All right. That's right. I was just about to say, everyone tell me now what this is. Lee's Restaurant. Exactly. There it is. It started out as Lee's Steakhouse and opened on July 5th, 1946. According to newspaper accounts, it became one of the best known restaurants between LA and Seattle on Highway 99. When the interstate came in the 60s, many businesses, including Lee's, came on hard times. But it survived by building up a strong local clientele. Reading those accounts, I really wanted a steak, I've got to tell you. It eventually closed in 1986 after almost 40 years of being in business because of rising insurance costs. And they'd always intended to reopen, but they ended up opening the business that we saw on the previous slide, the motorsports. And although this sounds like a pretty familiar story, interstate comes in, makes it tough, there are a couple of things that make this restaurant pretty unique. Take a look. It says Kentucky Fried Chicken, and yes, it was that Kentucky Fried Chicken. So, the now iconic Colonel Sanders, born Harlan Sanders, after holding down a variety of jobs, gained a reputation for the delicious chicken that he served out of his gas station. It became so popular that he quit the gas station business and opened a restaurant. Smart guy. There it is. The key to his success was the fast method he devised for cooking the chicken using a pressure cooker. It might also have had something to do with those 11 secret herbs and spices. That was in 1939. When Sanders found out that a new interstate would be bypassing his restaurant in Kentucky, he sold it in 1956. But he had a plan. A few years earlier, he had taught his friend Pete Harmon, who had a restaurant in Salt Lake City, how to cook his chicken. The success was so great that he set up several informal franchise arrangements with various restaurants. He received 4 cents for every chicken they cooked with this method. So when he sold his restaurant, he decided that he would make franchising his chicken his business. So he put a pressure cooker and some seasonings in his car and he hit the road. When he would come across a restaurant he liked, usually a mom and pop operation, he would go in and convince the owners to cook chicken for the employees, and then if they liked it, he would cook for the customers, signaling the beginning of franchise negotiations. So this is how Lee's Restaurant became one of the earliest franchises of Kentucky Fried Chicken. A newspaper article in 1986 suggested that Lee's had the very first franchise, but we know that this isn't true. In addition to his friend Pete, several other people made franchise deals with Sanders before he went on his road trip. I do think, however, that it is entirely possible that it could have been the first one in Washington State. In my search, I could not find any earlier advertisements than this one. And this is from 1958, this ad. So first owners Kay and Lee Bensley remodeled the restaurant, changing it to that look that we know today. They added a dance floor and a space for live entertainment. And then the Bensleys sold it to Leo and Alexandra Gillis in 1961. Her husband Leo died in 1963, and after that, his son Paul and wife Ruth shared the operation with Alexandra, who was known as Mama Gillis. Before coming to the Northwest, they were restaurateurs in Chicago. And before immigrating to the United States, they lived in Lithuania. They fled their country before the Russian invasion in 1945. Alexandra and Leo sacrificed their safety by hiding Jewish neighbors from invading German soldiers during World War II. They would have been caught and executed if not for a tip-off that the Germans were coming to inspect their home. And in the 80s, she was recognized for their bravery and awarded medals from Israel and from the Judaic Heritage Society. What a cool story. This small building is located on Pacific Avenue, just a couple buildings down from his house, Rainbow Floral, where that roundabout where Lacey and Pacific come together in the east. Lacey Roofing is there on the left side, and the right side is occupied by the Toy Box. Does anyone besides Balsley know what this building used to be? Holman. Yep, Holman Construction. It's hard to see because of the shadow, but the mid-century styling of the curved brick there on the facade remain. A.G. Holman Construction was one of the top construction contractors in the area during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Projects included major additions to Fort Lewis during World War II, the Capitol Pavilion, now known as Marcus Pavilion, on the St. Martin's campus, and much of South Sound Center and Panorama City. And these are just a few of Holman's professional contributions to South Sound communities. Does anyone know where this is? And I won't pick on you anymore. You get a prize. It's Holman Park now. That's right, exactly right. It's a ball field now. That park is located between the post office and Carpenter Road. Here it is now. So the last two places we looked at featured the Holman name. The Holmans were very important to Lacey becoming a city, and Al Holman was the first mayor of Lacey following the successful incorporation of the city. He took his oath of office on December 12th, 1966 at the newly built South Sound Mall, which also opened that year. And in November of the following year, he was reelected to a full 4-year term. Ooh, did he make headlines, though? He was known for his forceful style of leadership. Newspaper accounts are riddled with his public, heated arguments with members of the city council and his abrupt firing of the chief of police. He also pushed hard for growth. He used his experience as a businessman to attract new commerce to the area. I've heard from more than one source that Anna was the real leader behind Al, regularly calling people in his name to get what she wanted. With both of them having such strong personalities, I suspect it was a highly refined partnership. Imagine the pillow talk. Their role in local politics didn't end with his retirement as mayor. They were often publicly critical of decisions made by future city leaders. And they donated Holman Park to the city, and they're sitting there on the merry-go-round. That's not there anymore because I'm sure it's unsafe. The lakes and rivers of Lacey have also always been a really important part of our community and a source of beauty and recreation. This 1957 aerial shows how much they dominate the landscape, although it's pretty hard to tell these days since the shores are all developed with private homes. I'll point out to one member of our audience that the lower left picture there is Viola Holmes. We have a relative in the audience on Long Lake. It's hard to imagine now, but at the beginning of the 20th century, the north end of Long Lake was the site of the thriving community Union Mills. The mill started in 1896. After a huge fire in 1909, they rebuilt the facility for $100,000. That's $2.5 million today. When it reopened in 1910, it was the only all-electric lumber mill in the state of Washington. Pretty cool, huh? The bustling community included workers' cottages, a dormitory, movie theater, social hall, a store, and even its own post office and baseball team. Japanese men also worked at the mill, but they were not allowed to live in the company town. Instead, they lived in a segregated Japanese village, which kind of looked somewhat internment campish. I wish I had a picture of it. That's from accounts by people who have told me what it looked like. By the mid-1920s, business was slowing for the Union Lumber Company. And in 1926, the owners tried to sell it, but they did not have success. And 4 years later, it closed, and most of the buildings were demolished. However, not all traces of the mill town disappeared. If you drive around the Union Mills neighborhood, you'll find some structures that are still there, like this one, which was one of the superintendent's houses. And this is a Dutch colonial style home. The manager's houses were this style. A new era began for the Lacey area when Shortly after 1910, Frank Mullen opened up his property on Pattison Lake to visitors, eventually creating a resort which offered swimming and boating and cabins for rent. Soon, nearby Pattison Lake property owners and those on the other lakes, Hicks Lake, Long Lake, and Southwick Lake, followed suit. Eventually, there were at least 19 resorts on the lake at one time or another. It's kind of hard to know exactly how many because they changed names and owners a lot. And how do you count exactly? So it was a bunch. Here's a picture of Gwynn Hicks. He was the son of Lacey pioneer Urban East Hicks and was state printer at one time. Originally belonging to his stepmother's pioneer family, the Hartsocks, Gwynn inherited the large estate, which was he and his family's country home. They lived most of the time in Tacoma. They were known for hosting delightful parties and lavish and exclusive recreational events. And by the turn of the century, the last century, the estate became known as Gwynwood. The Hicks family was originally from Hannibal, Missouri. And yes, Gwynn Hicks' daughter, Hazel Hicks, tells of a very famous Hannibal, Missourian, Mark Twain, came to visit him at Gwynwood. Really wish we had a picture of that. In 1915, after the tragic death of Gwynn Hicks' fourth wife and their two small children in an auto accident, he made attempts to lease, sell, or even give away the property to be a recreational resort facility. Eventually, in 1923, he decided to open Gwynwood as a retreat and summer camp himself, with his son Celeste as manager. In addition to the main house, there were 5 cottages, 8 garages, a dance pavilion, bathhouse, water chute, boats, and floats. Upon his death in 1928, Hicks tried once again to give his property away for a public venture, but divorce proceedings from his 5th wife, Jessie, 37 years his junior, were already underway. She ended up with a sizable portion of the property, but was later sued by her own attorney for not paying her lawyer fees. In the late 20s and throughout the 30s, Gwynwood became host to the Red Cross Aquatic Schools, or First Aid and Life-Saving Institutes for Water Safety. These were written about in newspapers from California to Raleigh, North Carolina. They were very famous. And the summer's end was capped by an aquatic dancing show and costumed entertainment numbers a la Ethel Merman. I wish I could see them. They sounded amazing. I suggested to our aquatics people we should bring them back. They just gave me a blank stare, but that's okay. In 1933, the property was purchased by the Beckmans, and in 1937, the resort was purchased by the Risvolds, who gave us a lot of these photos. And in 1947, the Western Washington Conference of Christian Churches purchased the resort from Risvold for a campsite. And it is still owned by the Coalition of Christian Church Congregations in Western Washington, and it's available to people from all walks of life to rent for retreat, restoration, renewal, and recreation. And it's beautiful, and they just restored their lodge. Doesn't it look nice? There are also a few other publicly accessible lakefront properties as part of the city of Lacey. These are at Long Lake Park, Wanchers Park at Hicks Lake, and Lake Lois Habitat Reserve. So if you haven't been to any of those, you should. They're really gorgeous. Another big feature of Lacey is the South Sound Shopping Center, where today you can find Target and Kohl's, for example. And it does look a lot different than it did back then, right? Built in 1966, this was the first indoor mall between Northgate and Portland. When developer Bob Bloom sought financial support from Olympia business interests, they laughed at him. No one was going to drive to Lacey to shop. But he knew that being on the interstate between Seattle and Portland would make Lacey an ideal stop for travelers. And it was very successful for a long time. And yes, I did steal that from you, Ken Balsley. And in the upper right corner of this photo is the Lacey Drive-In. Let's talk about that a little bit. Located about where Value Village is today, the drive-in was opened in 1953 and could hold 500 cars. It had a concession stand and a playground for kids to play on while waiting for the movies to begin. Unfortunately, a storm damaged the screen in 1981, and it was never fixed. It was the end of the drive-in theater era here in Lacey. The screen and concession stand were finally torn down in 1988 to make room for Fred Meyer's and the related retail development that's there. For shopping, there was, of course, Sears, which was an important anchor for the mall, but also important was this American icon, Woolworths. These images are from their grand opening. They were in business at the mall from 1966 until 1999. That year, the mall was being redeveloped from an indoor mall to the more strip mall type that it is now, and Woolworths couldn't afford the rent anymore. And this area is now what is the backside of Target, so I didn't include a picture because it'd be really boring. Does anybody know what this is today? The Ernst? Michael's. That's right, Michael's. I just wish we still had the mid-century. I don't have a picture of it today.
Same place though, right?
I don't know. Was it next to it? Yeah. All right, I wanted to end with one of my favorite before and afters. Does anyone recognize this street? Right. It's Pacific Avenue in 1973. There are a few signs here besides that could give some clues. There's Market Square there, Moose Lodge. It's hard to see, but there's Melody Lane Tavern in the middle too. And then there's these street signs for Lacey Boulevard and Yelm. The reason it's hard to identify is because, well, it's changed a lot. What? The billboards are gone. So that picture was taken, if you're wondering, from that overpass, the one that's right about where the city lines are between Olympia and Lacey. The street has been straightened and widened, and of course, the billboards are gone, and it's now a one-way street. There were huge controversies in the 1970s about what to do about all of this visual pollution. There were political campaigns for city council members that was part of their platform, was to get rid of this. And they did. Anyway, I just love that difference. That is the end of my presentation, but I had to show you this gorgeous picture of Mount Rainier because I love it. It's beautiful. That's it. Thank you all so much for coming. This was really fun.